Welcome to the inaugural program of the new series, Family Ties, a collaboration between the Chinese American Museum and the Chinese Family History Group of Southern California. I'm Michael Trong, and I'm the Executive Director of the Chinese American Museum. I'd like to acknowledge and thank the FCAM board and staff and the board of the Chinese Family History Group of Southern California for supporting this event. And a special thank you to our community partners, Visual Communications, Chinese Historical Society of Southern California, the Chinese Society of Southern California, and the Bay Area Chinese Genealogy Group. Here are some things that you might need to know before the program begins. The program will be recorded and be made public for viewing in the future. Please keep your microphone and video off during the duration of the program. At the end of the program, we'll take a group photo. At this point, the Chinese Americans and staff will let you know when to turn on your video for those who would like to participate. And for the best experience, we ask participants to choose speaker view by moving your cursor to the top right and clicking on speaker view if you're using a computer. And if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please send a chat to the Chinese American Museum for further assistance. Some of you may know that this is not the first time that the Chinese American Museum has paired up with the Chinese Family History Group. Our most recent collaboration included hosting a 2-day genealogy workshop at Cal State LA, where we welcomed attendees from all over Southern California to learn how to begin the genealogy research. The workshop was successful and continued a long-lasting friendship between our two organizations. This year, we're collaborating once more to produce a series of online programs to help inspire and produce guidance for those who wish to begin or continue the family history journey. In tonight's program, Adventure in Finding My Family Stories, we will hear from 3 speakers where they will share pieces of their own adventures in discovering their family history. We hope you enjoy listening to the experiences, and we encourage you to post your questions in the chat box during the program. If time permits, we'll host a Q&A towards the end of the program. First, I'd like to introduce our moderator for Family Ties series. Leading the conversation is someone who is familiar with the Chinese American Museum. He has been an amazing docent for the museum, sharing the experiences of Chinese Americans and his own family history to our guests and visitors. He has led his own history adventures by researching his family heritage for over 30 years and have visited his ancestral village on 6 different occasions. He served as president of the Chinese Family History Group of Southern California from 2018 to 2020 and is currently on the board of directors. In his spare times, he enjoys assisting others researching their family roots. Please welcome our moderator for the program, Michael Ho. Michael, thank you for being here. I pass the program on to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for the introduction. And good evening to all of you. I am Michael Ho, past president of the Chinese Family History Group of Southern California, and I will be your moderator for the first in a series. We at the Chinese Family History Group of Southern California strive to inspire people to research their Chinese and Chinese American family histories. With what's happening in the world today, we are standing with others to emphasize to you, tell your story, tell our story. So this meeting tonight with the Chinese American Museum is very, very timely. Now, the focus of this meeting is not on the how to do aspects of family history. This evening will be a conversation with 3 speakers who will talk about their family stories and talk about the adventures and experiences while obtaining these stories. And this is all in the hopes that they'll be inspiration to you to tell yours. So I'm happy to introduce the panel for this evening. I want to start by introducing the first chairperson of the Chinese Family History Group during its first 2 formative years, Bogay Tong Salvador. Welcome, Bogay. I'd like to next introduce Marisa Louie Lee. Marisa is a freelance researcher and archivist and valued contributor to both of our organizations. Welcome to you, Marisa. And the third person on the virtual panel or dais tonight is Brian Yee. Brian is the president of Friends of Roots, a San Francisco-based nonprofit organization dedicated to linking your family history to the present by helping people trace their lineage back to their ancestral village and culminating in a visit to their village. So welcome to you, Brian. Welcome to you all. Now, each of our panelists was chosen to be on tonight's stage because they're different but similar perspectives. And 2 of the panelists, started their research at an early age, and one started a bit later in her life. So One of the things that people ask a lot of times is when you get started. Mike earlier just mentioned that I've been studying my family history for about 30 years now, and I can look back. I actually got started. I was actually at an undergraduate. I was taking an Asian American Studies class, which actually wasn't part of my major, but I just took it because I was interested in the subject. It wasn't a requirement at that time. And I had heard that if I took that class, it would help my social life, which it didn't really. But anyway, I took the class, and the assignment I had was I had a choice of either interviewing somebody in the family or making a family tree. And I chose a family tree, but instead of just drawing a family tree, I ended up creating a multi-page paper. I took documents and photos, and I went a little bit overboard. But that's how I got started. And I've had a chance to talk with the panelists here, and I was surprised to learn that some of the other panelists also had some academic background in their start. And in particular, I was talking to Marisa. I believe you had a story about that, right?
Yeah, so similar to you, Michael, I think that, I got started with my family tree project. I think that was middle school, though I might have been like in 6th grade, where I was, finding the names of my, grandparents and my great-grandparents, and putting the family tree together to kind of, in a very, basic sense, figure out, who my family was. And then it wasn't until high school that I really kind of started to connect that family tree with history. I did a high school assignment writing about Chinese exclusion, and I began to say, oh, okay, well, these must be the things that affected my family. I took that to the next level when I went to UC Santa Cruz and had the great privilege to study with Dr. Judy Young, who taught in the American Studies department there. I became an American Studies major, wrote my undergraduate senior thesis, under her advisorship. And, thinking about that, I realized just how deeply I benefited from having those college level ethnic studies courses, because, those weren't available to folks 30 plus years ago. And then on the same token, I realized how much I would have loved to have had that material and that exposure to history from such a, at a young age, starting in 6th grade or earlier. I, later went to work for the Chinese Historical Society of America here in San Francisco and the National Archives, and kind of stepped away from doing my own personal research while I was, busy helping everyone else with theirs. And only over the last couple of years, I've really come back to my own work, thanks to groups like the Chinese Family History Group of Southern California, finding a lot of camaraderie and connections with folks in groups like yours.
Well, that's a great story to hear. And, I can remember I met Dr. Judy Young actually at a CAM event here in LA. So I had a pleasure of meeting her and Erica Lee, who at the time, I believe they were talking about one of their books. And Brian, I understand you have a connection with Dr. Judy Young as well.
Yeah. Like Marisa, I also went to UC Santa Cruz, go Slugs. Unlike Marisa, I wasn't an American Studies major. So I didn't have it as a kind of a requirement and the opportunity to take upper division classes, but I was able to take a lower division class with her my first quarter there. It's like Asian American Studies up to 1945. And she basically, was able to put out there that my family's kind of story was a story that was like a history that was taught, that other people knew it. And there were people who had researched it and written plenty of books on it. It was just something that we didn't have access to, until we got into college. And so it was one of those eye-opening experiences to know that there was all of this kind of research available and all this kind of, history that was collated and collected that people had done. And, it kind of showed the value of it that perhaps hadn't seen more than a few paragraphs here and there in the previous years of schooling.
I see. And, Bogey, now, do you have any your start in studying family history, was it anything based with academia or?
Well, in a way, however, my experience is, unfortunately, I don't have the benefit or did not have the benefit of Asian American Studies classes anywhere in my elementary, high school, college life, because I grew up in the 50s and 60s. I'm a few decades older. And I grew up in the San Fernando Valley in an almost all white area. So, but nevertheless, regardless, there was nothing in the curricula in those days. And I went off to Stanford University in the Bay Area. And in the late 60s and early 70s, when surrounding me were I was in the era of the Third World movements, the Asian American movements, the anti-war movement, and I was very much exposed to that and very much influenced by those movements. Those were the Asian American movement, the Third World movements were actually, people were demanding Asian American studies classes, for instance, minority studies classes, because there was nothing during those days. So some of us had found each other, Asian Americans at Stanford, and decided to, in response to what we were seeing and feeling, to create the Asian American Studies, Asian American Student Alliance. And we were so hungry for any information. We realized we knew nothing about very little about our Chinese American history. And so we were very hungry. And I remember that we asked one of the only, I believe, experts in Chinese American history at that time in the area. His name was Stanford Lyman, and I believe that he was teaching at Cal Berkeley, at UC Berkeley. He came down and gave us a few lectures on our history as Chinese in America. And it was so enlightening. I just remember being so hungry about it, about learning in a place where I couldn't take a real class on the subject. And I also remember scouring the Stanford libraries. One of them was Hoover Tower Library, for anything that had to do with Chinese American history. I found some things, but not very much. So I think that was an inspiration that I didn't really understand at the time. I didn't make the connection. Well, now that I know all this, why don't I find out about how my family, which is like, for instance, 4 generations in in California, how do they fit into Chinese American history? You know, why is it important to me, since I'm part, my family was part of all those eras that I studied about. So I think it wasn't until more recently, much more recently, that I found other relatives that were very interested in and had done some research in the genealogy and made some discoveries. I got inspired by them. What one person does, you know, it's very inspiring. And so I think it took a while to make those connections. And now I feel like I know much more where I came from, and it has really grounded me.
Wow, that's an amazing story there. And, you know, one of the things people were asked, of course, I think people want to hear is, you know, what have you found out in your particular research? You know, and so I'll pose a question to our panelists is, you know, what would be possibly one of the most surprising things you found, or what did you find in your research, you know, that you know, maybe you did not expect at all going in? You know the history, you kind of know where the trajectories of things people might be doing, but you found out about your families, your respective families. What did you find surprising in your stories? Boge, do you have something to start with, maybe?
Well, yeah, I do have something to start with. I have a couple stories, but I'll start with this one. I didn't know much about my maternal grandmother because she died when I was 16, and she was in ill health before that. So I think about asking her about her earlier life, but this person has kind of been inspirational to me in late life. I wish I had known about her earlier, because I think I might have been inspired to be a stronger or braver or more resilient person. Her name is Florence Oi Chan, and she was born in 1885 in San Francisco, second generation. She, at the age of 6, her father died. Her mother evidently couldn't take care of her, so she was sent to her uncle's place in Sebastopol, California. And the next thing I know, we know about her, and is that she ran away to the Cameron House in San Francisco at about age 14, a very young age of 13 or 14. And the reason I know this, and the Cameron House, by the way, is, for those of you who may not know, was a Presbyterian mission and that had as its main objective to rescue Chinese girls and young Chinese girls and women who from the slave trade or from indentured servitude in those days. And Donaldina Cameron, who was head of that mission at the time my grandmother ran to it, was the director, and she is credited with saving thousands of girls' lives. So the log that was found for me, there's an entry, Cameron House entry log that states that she arrived and she was unhappy living with her uncle, and that she had too much work, and that she wanted to go to school. And I'm deducing from that she was not allowed to go to school. Instead, she had to work probably for her uncle, either in the home or somewhere else. So I found out that she argued that day, and her uncle claimed her as his ward with an attorney, and there was a lot of argument, and she was strong enough and held out enough where finally all parties were agreed that she was able to stay. So she stayed there for quite a few years, and she met my grandfather at the mission, and they got married. So that is one of the kind of inspirational stories for me that I have about my grandmother.
Wow. And, that was something that just started from, really, it wasn't something you were looking for specifically, right?
Not necessarily. My mother, it's, a clue. You get a clue sometimes from your parents. My mother always said, your grandmother ran away to the Cameron House, and she was unhappy or she was mistreated. But I didn't ask, and I didn't know the details. And so I was always very, very curious. And I think one thing that people need to do when they're in their research is to kind of just talk to people who you think may know something. And I did talk to a friend who knew someone who could give me, who was in charge of the archive there, or the log there. And this person was able to find this entry for me. So if I hadn't just been talkative and just asked around, I don't think I would have found this information as early as I did.
Right. And Marisa, so, you've actually, during your career, you've worked helping others. And so I think you probably have found some experience of that, people talking about things and discussing things, getting that started. But, back to you, what was the surprising discovery in your research?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that really made me realize that I was in family history research for the long haul, this wasn't just going to be like a one and done summer project in colleges. When I first went to the National Archives facility here in the Bay Area, when I was a college sophomore, and I'd heard, I lived in the area, kind of just south of San Francisco, down the peninsula, as a kid. And, I'd always heard, there are records, for folks who are Chinese American at the National Archives in San Bruno. And, so I literally just parked in the parking lot and walked in one day. And had some names, written on a piece of paper, and had no idea what to find. But the archive staff there were incredibly welcoming and accommodating. And I showed them what I had, and they, pointed me to sit down and look at some lists of names. I wrote down some things that looked like they'd matched. And, they pulled records for me there on the spot. It's not what they do nowadays. So, nowadays you need to make an appointment and kind of, do things in a slightly more organized fashion. But within a couple of hours of walking in, I sat in the research room and opened a folder and saw the spitting image of my grandfather reflected in the face of my great-grandfather. And then, from there, found records relating to my great-grandmother, to, her family that I had no idea about whatsoever. And I think by the end of that summer, I had a copy paper box worth of, photocopies of my family's immigration records, and not just immigration records, because so many of them were born here in the United States and, and never immigrated, in the first place. It was their Chinese Exclusion Act records. I think the most surprising thing that I found through the course of that is the story that I shared during last month's Chinese Family History Group program, which was that my great-grandmother was actually born here in the United States, and she was actually my very first, U.S. citizen ancestor. So through her, I can kind of count that I'm a fifth generation Chinese American. She was born in Fresno in 1887. And I had no idea about her story. During the program last month, I shared that she actually lost her American citizenship through marriage. And, I had no idea about, the laws around expatriation, how those were unfairly applied to people who married quote unquote aliens ineligible for citizenship, meaning, any person of Asian descent at that time. So, I think it's been incredible for me to see how much about American history that I see reflected in my own family story.
Well, that is amazing to find stories like that. You're especially things that it's not something you can even imagine to think of. Writing it, you couldn't write that out. Write a fictional piece about it. These are stories like that. Brian, what about you? Any surprising discoveries in your family history research?
I guess for my family, when I did research, I was able to talk with my my dad's parents. That's the side that's Chinese, and for the most part, they were very forthcoming in the information that they had. And it was somewhat limited in the sense that my great-grandfather had come over, and then my grandmother was born here, which today's her 100th birthday. And then my grandfather, he had come over here when he was 2. So they didn't have any like pre-here memories necessarily. And so it's just kind of oral history that they'd heard from their parents. And the parents had never gone back except for when my grandmother's father had taken her brother back to China to get married and find a bride, basically. And so for me, all the stuff that I was researching, it was just coming up to the dead, a wall basically pre-1920, because they didn't have documents. They didn't think they would keep any of these like cards around and stuff. And checking at the National Archives, there were some documents of people who had come in, and then they basically laid low after that. So there wasn't a lot of travel. They didn't build out a huge kind of case file for me to kind of get any extra leads on this. But when I went back to a village that I had thought was the one that my great uncle had pointed to, we had gone further away than we kind of had expected in Toisan, and had gone down to this village, and I had a list of names, and I knew if my great grandfather had gone back, surely they would know his name if he had passed away there. And sure enough, we go to a village. Turns out it happens to be a Louie village. Turns out they know that name, and the person who's acknowledging this is about the same age as my dad. And he says, that was my father. And I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, this doesn't quite make sense, that this person who is at least 20 years younger than he should be to be claimed this, not only has like the same name as my great uncle, but his father's the same name. And I things started not lining up. These little story pieces don't quite like fit in. So my biggest surprise out of this was like, as I'm digging further into this, it's almost as if there's like a clone village that was there. And I started to question like, is this a manufactured story that everyone went with? Or is this was this like the ultimate Paper Sun story where everyone had that exact same story that I happened to stumble upon? But the reality, I think it just was that, if you're in your 80s and the last time you've been back to this place was something about 50 years ago, if you're looking on a map, you may point to a village that has the same name, but you can be a little bit off. And for me, the biggest takeaway really from that was like just the value of like, what did it really matter for me of getting the specific details on this versus the broader scope picture? Like if I hadn't, as Boge said, kind of just kept digging into it, I wouldn't have necessarily gotten the truth out of this. I would have been like, oh, I have this village where we have a second uncle who has the exact same name as like someone who shouldn't have been like. So I think for me, the biggest really takeaway is, you want to kind of keep scratching at some of the things, and you have the details, and if you want to be certain, you kind of have to go with your gut. and trust that, like, okay, does everything line up, or is it kind of a little bit off, you know?
So regarding that, did you find out about that story? Like,
yeah, so,
you know.
yeah. So we went to this village. We had a photo from the 50s that my great uncle had taken, and I had a picture of the village. So I knew that there had been a village. All the details didn't quite line up. There used to be a tower, and there's a tower in the picture. And then they said, oh, there was a tower, but we stored fireworks in it, so that tower's gone. You know, there was a mountain range in the background, which looked similar, but in real life, there was more rocks. And we thought it's possible China just like redeveloped the land and kind of changed the mountains, you know. So all of these things were kind of just like not quite adding up. And then sure enough, we come back, and I double check with my great uncle, and I show him, you know, where we went and the name, and he kind of just looks at it and he's like, oh, I don't think that's the right area. And, you know, then he asks his wife, and she comes over and she points, and she's like, you went to the wrong area. It's over here. You know, so it's like, if you don't double check and like get them to confirm sometimes, it can cost you like a whole year. But, you know, a year isn't so much, you know.
But did you end up, I guess people are going to be wondering, were you able to go back to the right place?
I ended up going back, and there's a picture of like this village, and the village looks exactly the same. The mountains line up, the background matches everything. You know, there's still the tower that's there. They know what was stored into it, and they didn't store fireworks. And I was able to point out like which house my great grandfather had been in, and which house my uncle had actually stayed at when he had gone back to stay in the village waiting to like find a wife per se. And so we found a trunk case that had, you know, his name on it, and there was mail from San Francisco written back there. So it was like an additional confirmation that, again, I did not find a second clone village, which would have been suspicious.
Right. So it sounds like, I mean, a reoccurring theme there is you have to be a little persistent about things, you know, maybe not take everything the first thing you see and say, well, yeah, let me, you know, never fit the story to, you know, make the answer fit you necessarily, I guess is one thing you have to do. Now, you know, I think sometimes people, you know, find the research it can be a bit daunting at times, especially when you have, you know, just like you were talking about, you know, people don't keep records. There's no, you know, there's an assumption that there's nothing around, you know, the people have passed away. You don't have these, you know, resources to talk to or ask about. So, you know, some people might be out there and asking, you know, well, you know, why should I even bother doing research? You know, what the heck am I really going to find? You know I'm not, you know, my family is not descended from royalty or, you know, we don't have any, you know, as far as we know, no celebrities. So, you know, so maybe the one question people might ask is, why should I even bother with this? You know, Marisa, what do you say to people who might ask that question?
Oh gosh, you're asking the one who loves history, why bother with history? I mean, like why bother with the lives of ordinary people? You know, I mean, if someone is like a grocery store owner or a laundry person or a cannery worker, like, does that make them any less important to know their story and to tell their story? You know, I think, you know, Michael, in your introduction, you know, you said that, you know, now like it's such an imperative time to be telling our stories and sharing our stories, you know, because that will keep, you know, us as Asian Americans, you know, as people of color from being erased, right? And it's really, you know, there's a field called social history. And the idea behind social history is that we're very, very concerned with the lives of ordinary people, and that we have just as much significance in terms of, you know, being the ones who shape and are shaped by, you know, great societal changes. And I, if anything, I actually have been lucky to have had that outlook on history, you know, to have had that social history perspective from a very young age. My maternal grandparents, and I have some maternal family in the audience, so hi everyone. So they were really good friends with someone named Thomas Chin, and he was one of the founders of the Chinese Historical Society of America in San Francisco. they were hardware store owners. They, bought a hardware store that my maternal grandmother had worked at when she came to the United States in the in the 40s. And so they bought that store in the 1960s and ran it for 30 years. In 1989, Thomas Chin wrote a book called Bridging the Pacific, and I pulled my copy off the shelf just to have it as a lucky token next to me. So in this book, he writes about my grandparents. He has this section where he says, well, I'm going to take this time after writing about kind of the movers and shakers in San Francisco Chinatown, just to write about my friends, because it's my book and I can, right? And so, so he has a section called Personal Glimpses, and he says, these people are my friends, but but they're people whose stories are worth telling. And he goes in and he says, May and Leland, moved to the United States in the 1940s. They immigrated here in the 1940s, and they have 6 kids, and they own a hardware store, and they work really hard. And there's 4 paragraphs dedicated to telling their story. And how cool is it that I, as a young child, had my grandparents and my mom's name in a book that, with alongside, like the very first Chinese American school teacher in San Francisco, or, the very first, X, Y, or Z. I always grew up knowing that their story was just as significant as other stories, and always was worth telling. So I think the why bother is because, your family's story is worth knowing and worth sharing. I also have small children now. And, so I think that I bear even more responsibility to now that I have little people to share these stories with. But, I want them to grow up knowing, the stories of their family. My husband's family has a pretty incredible, story here in the US as well. And so I'm doing a lot more work now because I, have another family whose stories I need to share with Viv and Kate. So, yeah.
Well, that's great. That's a great perspective on things. Just a side note, you were talking about finding this something in a book, and I remember doing research, and I'd found on different occasions for different parts of the family certain photos in the National Archives, in the certain case files of ancestors or relatives in there, and then sort of, maybe it's ironic or not, but those specific, I found examples of some of those photos being published in some different books. And they were just kind of random, because I think someone looked in their archives looking for something that was representative of either, the Chinese American experience or of a family and things like that. So it's sort of surprising. Yeah, just flipping open a book like, hey, wait, I know who that person is.
That's so-and-so, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Why are they in this book? So, but yours is a little more specific because they actually identify them.
Right. And I think it's cool that, then Michael, rather than just being, typical Chinese man, walking down street, that we actually can tell the stories behind, these faces, and they become so much more complex and rich that way.
Right. And one word you mentioned was ordinary. And I think that's an important point, is that, is there anything really ordinary about that experience of an immigrant to America, of raising a family or generations and so on? So, that's not necessarily diminishing it, the importance of that. Now, Bogey, what about you? What do you say about that? About, people were saying, why bother? Why should I do this?
Right. Yeah, I have some things to say about that. I echo what Marisa is talking, everything that she's saying. To add to that, I think it is with ordinary people, they can be even more motivating and more inspirational to us if we learn about what they went through in their lives, their hardships, in the face of, especially those that lived during the Chinese Exclusion Acts, in the face of discrimination or whatever they might have faced. And even if they failed, I think we can learn a lot from their lives, and it can also inspire us, and we can understand where we came from. There are a couple of other reasons why I think that it's important for us to do research and find out about our families and document them. And one of them is I think Marisa already said that it's important to bestow our legacy and our family history to our descendants. If we do the research, even if they're not interested now, someday they're going to be. And we may not be around to provide that, so we should do it now. The other reason that speaks to me, again, is what Marisa said about, for Chinese Americans and Asian Americans, there's still not that much written in history books, in textbooks, and in other places. And when there is, it's still dry facts of history, basically. So I think telling our stories, finding our family stories, gives credence to many events in to Chinese American history in itself. And real life stories, personal stories, really shed a lot of light on how it was in those eras. And it's a testament. They are testaments to what really happened in history. So I think it's extra important for us as Asian Americans to be finding these stories, telling them, and somehow documenting them and leaving them for others.
Great. And what about you, Brian? What do you say to people who ask, why bother?
It's hard to kind of set people's expectations that you'll find like a celebrity or like a mention in a book. But I think it's very easy for them to kind of align on the idea that you may find out about some people that you love and you cherish, facts that they normally would not tell you, and facts that would probably surprise you, and facts that like in your mind paint a picture of who this person was decades before you even like showed up. As an example, like the idea of my grandmother, who's she's probably barely 4'11". Just the idea of her, ice skating blows my mind, because I can't think of where in San Francisco she would have even like tried to do that. But she knew how to ice skate because she had to go out to Minnesota to help her sister. And so like, there's just these small little family stories that we start collecting when we ask our grandparents, where did you go to high school? How did you meet grandpa? And then you find out, oh, you met on a dance hall? Was he a good dancer? And when you find out that he was terrible at dancing, but it didn't stop him from trying to get on her dance card, you realize they literally had a dance card. They literally like were very selective who would make it on this. And so somehow he overcame those odds to like dance with her. And those are the stories that I think when they're long gone that you'll still cherish. Those are the ones that you value. And like for you and your family, those are the stories that like really become like part of the family history, part of like the importance of what you pass down, because like this person, who you love, you're trying to pass that love on to the next generation. And the easiest way to do it is on the parts that you like, it may be shocking, and it may be shocking in a great way, but it may also just really define that this person was not the expectation that people think at the end of their life. They were much more than that. So it's always an amazing chance to find those.
Yeah, and it's something I've know personally, when you find something that, maybe it's sort of like in the family, people kind of dismiss it, or just like, oh, well, didn't you know, your grandma did this. She had a little, like my grandma, oh, she had a beauty shop. Oh, well, that's nice. And then when you put it in the context of things, say, wait a minute, she opened her own beauty shop. She was an entrepreneur. Right. It was in the 1930s, in the Depression, and she had her own business. Exactly. Independent women, and it's a different perspective, if you look at it. But sometimes families just like, well, well, she cut my hair. That was the extent of what you heard, right? So, but it's important to look at that from different levels. I think we're going to head in some questions. One of the open questions I'm just going to ask the panelists right now is, what are you doing now? You've been doing research, and are you still going at it? Are you focusing on one thing in particular right now? I'm kind of going in order. I didn't plan it that way, but I'll start with Marisa. What are you doing now as far as research?
Oh, as far as research.
Or whatever. I mean, you just hanging out. We're on a Zoom, right?
My daughter goes back to school next week, so I'll have so much more time for research after that. So I think over the last year, thanks, for example, there's a researcher I think is affiliated with the Chinese Family History Group, Michael, who last year connected me with her copy of the Louie family clan genealogy. And, with the help of some folks from the Roots program, John Wang, Brandon Louie, we found my great-grandfather in that clan genealogy. And I had never, I thought it would be so hard for me to ever get a copy of my Louie family genealogy. But, you know, thanks to the connections I have in this community, you know, I found him in like the 24th generation, you know, and then was able to go back up into the, you know, the first generation in that genealogy. Yeah, it's pretty incredible. And if anything, it really inspired me to pick up the Louie family history again. So, you know, I've gone back to looking at the NARA records that I collected, you know, nearly 2 decades ago, to try and, you know, piece together, you know, what my Louie family was like. They lived in Fresno from the 1880s to the 1930s. You know, were very, very Chinese American, you know, in that way. And so, yeah, it's kind of, you know, thanks to Margaret and, you know, her connecting me with the clan genealogy, you know, it's kind of given me a new jolt of energy to be able to do this work. Yeah, and I think, you know, I'll make the COVID, you know, pandemic connection. You know, I've been at home with my kids a lot more over the last year. And it's really made me think, you know, like, well, you know, if I'm going to be at home with you, and if, you know, I want to do something family history related, like, how can I get you involved? And so, you know, it's kind of made me think about, you know, what doing family history with young children could be like, you know, what kinds of projects we can come up with, and, you know, what kind of framework, you know, I can maybe offer other folks with young families. You know, since we've been here in San Francisco a lot more, you know, we have gone for walks in Chinatown, say, and it's been really cool for me to take them past places that are of significance to our family. So, you know, we went for a walk a couple of weeks ago after visiting the new Chinese playground, and I walked them past the elementary school where my dad, their grandpa, went to school. And, you know, when I was there, I was like, well, you know, it's now named after the very first Chinese American city supervisor, Gordon J. Lau, but it used to be the Oriental School, which was the segregated school where, you know, children of Chinese and Japanese and other Asian descents were forced to be segregated. So, you know, me sharing this on the sidewalk with my 2.5 and 6-year-old, I'm starting them early. But it's neat, you know, that now, since we're here, like, you know, we're really connecting with our roots here in San Francisco. And it's really kind of inspired me to continue that kind of work.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Yeah, like you said, if the kids are back in school, you have so much more time, right?
So much more time.
What about you, Bogey? What are you up to?
Yes, what I'm mostly concentrating on now is a website for my Chinese and Hawaiian ohana, for my family. My Chinese, this is my fraternal side of the family. And it turns out my fraternal side, my great-great-great-grandfather came over from China to Hilo, Hawaii in 1850. He already had a wife and child, a son in China, but when he came over to work in the sugar plantations, and soon he married also a young Hawaiian woman, and they had 5 daughters. So, and then of course they had descendants of those daughters. And I don't have time to tell the story of how we discovered the Hawaiian side of the family, but we have had several reunions. It's been life-changing to me. I've learned so much about my Hawaiian, my heritage in Hawaii. And that's been very, very valuable to me. So when we had this reunion in 2019, the last one before the pandemic, we decided to create a website, and where we can document our research, document biographies, document photos of reunions and photos of our ancestors. And the main reason is not to document this just for ourselves, but we're hoping that this will pull in the younger generations, which, as you know, sometimes, unlike Brian and Marisa, don't get that interested in their parents' or their grandparents' history until much older. So we're hoping that we can, if we have a good website and we're organized, and it's organized well, that it will be a learning experience and a lasting legacy for this family. And I think it's brought us together. In other words, there are other relatives who are also getting inspired to write up biographies, to find information and contribute to this website. So I think it's really important that we not just do research, but somewhere along the line, we think about how we're going to write it down for others, whether it's a book, an essay, or a slideshow, video, whatever. I think it's important to think about where you're going to go with this.
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, it's something when you research something and you can record it, but how do you share it? And that's probably another discussion we could have in the future. And especially with maybe a different generation that, you know, maybe more inclined to look at an electronic device than a book or something like that. You know, I know we're winding out a little bit here, but Brian, what about you? What are you up to?
Well, so once COVID hit and travel basically stopped for us, that impacted our programs. Two of the big things that we do with our programs, we help people with their genealogy research, and then we kind of culminate on it and go back to the village. And not be able to go back to the village, it kind of allowed us still to do the first part. So we helped a lot of, you know, participants in the program do the research, and then basically put them on like a holding pattern until we knew if we could travel. And while we were on the holding pattern, we kind of just mentally assessed the fact that the demand probably was not going to go down, and we needed to be prepared for that when everything was lifted. And so we did a lot of like internal kind of supporting for like new leaders and kind of like help, like, how can we make this easier for the people who have kids and families now? Because a lot of the program leaders that we have, you know, some of them are starting to have new families, and, you know, their time commitments are a little bit different. And so we focused a good amount of our time of the past year kind of just in that aspect, with the anticipation that the moment this travel thing gets kind of really clear for us and lifted, we would resume being able to take people back to the villages and then deal with this large backlog that we may get of people who want to do this and help.
And so, by the way, for those who didn't catch it, Brian, you're with the Friends of Roots program. And so
right.
Typically in a non-pandemic situation, I mean, how many, are there multiple trips organized?
Yeah, in a normal year, we've had about 12 or so that go during the summer, and then between spring and fall, in either time, it can range anywhere from like 12 to, you know, mid 30s of, you know, for the family groups that will go. And so it's a large amount of people that I think are just waiting for the go ahead and the green light for us to travel. And, you know, so if you're looking at about, you know, 50 at least people per year that are doing this, and, you know, some people wait years to do the program. Just, you know, once they can get all their family kind of lined up on like one schedule, you know, it's hard to coordinate like two people. Imagine coordinating your entire family to all show up and then say, okay, we're gonna all leave the country at the same time and be out for at least 5 to 7 days. You know, it can take years to get that commitment from everyone, but
right.
We're ready for you guys.
Great. Okay, well, we have some questions from the audience. I'm going to try and ask them to our panel here. And I know we were trying to not make this a how-to, but we'll try and open it up because we do have some questions like that. One of the questions is, did the speakers do research on their grandparents, or I guess it could be earlier, and where they came from, or just the family that came to America? So I guess I guess that depends on what your family, respectively, where your grandparents, you know, grew up and so on. But so did you do research on your grandparents, or where they came from, or just the family that came to America? So have at it first. Bogey's nodding. I'll let you start.
Yes, I understand.
And Bogey, could you speak a little louder if you can? Thank you.
Yes. No, I haven't done much research or any research on the area or the history of my roots in China. I know on and that's what I need to do, especially on my maternal side. I have just recently found out the names of my, I guess, great grandparents who migrated from China. And I didn't even know their names. And I don't know where, you know, much about them, where they died, anything like that. So yes, I need to do that. On my fraternal side, there are people, relatives do know about the origins, and some have been actually back to the actual village. And that is on my wish list, is to be able to go back and actually experience where my great-grandfather and even prior to that, where they lived. So I think, yes, it's important. I just haven't gotten there yet.
Okay, we're kind of in a lightning round now. I've been told the directors are saying a lightning round. So let's go with Marisa real quick. What's your quick answer about how did you start researching your grandparents, where they came from, where the family came to America?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know this isn't a how-to, but if you're going to do research, you start with who you know. So start with yourself, then you go back to your parents. So when you start your research, you never want to jump to that earliest generation, I would say anyone starting out to start with what you know and the folks that you know the best, and to work backwards from there. I'm not going to even share who I started with or my own personal answer, but that's my my how-to. So
okay, what about you, Brian?
I would say it's very similar to what Marisa said. I think depending on the generation, the family that came over, it could be the grandparents, or the family that came over, it could be the great-grandparents or the great-great-grandparents. California's history with like Chinese immigrants goes very far back. So you could have family that came over, in the mid 1800s, and that's no one's grandparents right now that's alive. So you'd have to, you're going further and further back. So I think you're basically, if you're looking at your family and your grandparents, you're looking at the same thing. But like Marisa said, start at home, go to your parents, and then work your way back to people that you know until you get to your obstacles.
Great. Well, I think we are running out of time, and I would love to ask you these other questions. They're a little more nuts and bolts kind of questions we're getting from our audience members. And I know whether it's going to be with a forum like this, or we may have some other program, maybe our family history group might have some similar, some kind of a program to address those specific questions. So I think we might need to wrap it up now, and we'll bring it back on Michael Trung.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Boge, Marisa, and Brian, for sharing your stories with us tonight. And thank you to our audience, and we hope you feel inspired to take on the adventures of researching your own family roots. Before we wrap up, I'd like to invite everyone to participate in the Cam family tradition. At the end of the program, we snap a group photo of all of our attendees. Though we may be miles apart, we are grateful to still be able to connect through virtual platforms. If you'd like to participate for this group photo, we ask if you could turn on your video now. I'll hand it over to the CAM staff member, Alyssa, to provide further instructions.
Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Those who would like to participate in our group photo, please turn on your video. If you're having any issues turning on your video, please use the raise hand button in the participants box, and a staff member will help assist. Now we're going to take this time to give everyone a chance to turn on their videos, and I'll let you know when we are ready.
And as we work to help everyone turn on the video, I'd like to remind all of you that this is the first in a series of programs regarding learning techniques on how to gather your family history. We invite everyone to follow CAM and the Chinese Family History Group of Southern California on Facebook and Instagram to stay up to date on future programming. If you will find the links to our social media in the chat box shortly. Alyssa, are we ready to take the photo?
Yes, we are ready to go, and I will now begin taking the group photo, so please smile, everyone.
Once again, thank you to our guest speakers and to our partners, the Chinese Family History Group of Southern California. We hope you can join CAM next week for our panel discussion on the documentary film, A Chinese American Giant, the Y.C. Hong Story, and keep a lookout for our next program in the Family Ties series in the future. Michael Ho, I pass it for you for your closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Michael Trung. And I want to thank again our panelists, Boge, Marisa, and Brian, for sharing their stories with you tonight. We're putting their contact information in the chat box. So I know we probably have you may have some specific questions or comments. You can address them that way. Please feel free to share your thoughts with them. And if you have questions about the Chinese Family History Group, the Friends of Roots program, or Marisa's research consultation services, please feel free to contact the appropriate people there. Now, for comments on tonight's program or topics you'd like to be explored in the next part of the Family Ties series, please email us at programs@chinese-family.org. ChineseFamilyHistory.org. We hope you will join us for our monthly webinar on Saturday, April 24th. And that will be our group, the Chinese Family History Group in Southern California, will be presenting Patrick Chu. And he's going to be talking about Qingming, cemeteries, and names. So look for that. Registration is available at our website, which is www.chinesefamilyhistory.org. And you can also find us on Facebook. So please follow us on Facebook and Instagram, CFHGSC. Thank you again. I hope you enjoyed the program. Be safe and have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone.